Hello, my dear friends. For most of human history, worry and fear were not seen as conditions of the mind. They were seen as signs from the body, from spirits, or from fate itself. When women felt constant unease, racing thoughts, tight chests, or sleepless nights, societies did not call this anxiety. They gave it other names. These feelings were woven into ideas about weakness, emotion, and the nature of womanhood. Treatment did not aim to understand the mind. It aimed to quiet the body and restore order. In ancient civilizations, anxiety in women was often linked to imbalance. In Egypt, Greece, and later Rome, healers believed the body worked through fluids and forces that had to remain in harmony. When a woman felt restless or fearful, it was believed that something inside her had shifted out of place. The cause was rarely thought to be stress or trauma. Instead, it was blamed on the womb, on blood, or on disturbed internal heat. The body was treated as the source of the problem, not the mind. Greek doctors described a condition they believed came from the womb moving inside the body. They thought this movement caused choking feelings, panic, and sadness. This belief shaped treatment for centuries. Women were told to lie down, breathe certain scents, or be exposed to strong smells to guide the womb back into position. These methods were not cruel in intention. They were based on the idea that anxiety had a physical location and could be corrected like a misplaced organ. In Rome, similar ideas remained strong. Women who appeared nervous or fearful were often advised to marry, to bear children, or to increase household duties. The belief was that an active domestic life would calm the body. Restlessness was seen as idleness or imbalance rather than as distress. Emotional pain was not treated with conversation. It was treated with routine and labor. In ancient China, anxiety in women was explained through the movement of energy within the body. Healers believed that blocked or uneven energy caused fear and unease. Treatments focused on restoring flow. Teas were prepared from calming plants. Needles were placed along paths believed to guide inner forces. Silence and breathing were encouraged. Yet even here, anxiety was still tied to physical imbalance rather than personal experience. In India, emotional distress in women was connected to harmony between body and spirit. If worry grew too strong, it was believed that daily rhythm had been broken. Sleep, food, and rest were prescribed. Women were told to avoid heavy thought and intense emotion. Calmness was valued as health. Anxiety was not named as illness but as disorder in life habits. During the Middle Ages in Europe, fear and unease in women were often explained through religion. Anxiety became linked to sin, temptation, or spiritual weakness. A woman who worried constantly or cried often might be told she was being tested by unseen forces. Treatment involved prayer, fasting, or confession. The mind was not studied, the soul was judged. Medical practice in this period mixed old ideas with new fear. Herbal drinks were given to quiet nerves. Warm baths were used to soften tension. Yet strong emotion was still viewed with suspicion. A woman who showed distress too openly could be labeled unstable or dangerous. Anxiety became something to hide rather than something to heal. By the early modern period, a new word began to appear: hysteria. This term came from the Greek word for womb and carried forward the ancient belief that women's bodies caused their mental distress. Anxiety, sadness, and fear were grouped together under this name. Doctors treated it with massages, steam baths, and forced rest. The woman's own story was rarely asked for. Her body was adjusted while her feelings were ignored. In wealthy households, anxious women were often sent to lie down for long periods. This was called rest treatment. They were told not to read, not to write, and not to think deeply. Silence was believed to heal. In reality, it often increased isolation. Yet this was considered proper care. A quiet woman was seen as a healthy woman. Poor women received different treatment. They were expected to work through their distress. Anxiety was seen as weakness that labor could cure. If fear remained, it was blamed on character rather than on illness. This divided treatment showed that anxiety was shaped by class as much as by belief. In the 19th century, medicine began to name anxiety more clearly, but women were still treated differently from men. A nervous man was said to be tired. A nervous woman was said to be fragile. Doctors believed that female emotion was natural and excessive by nature. Treatment still focused on controlling behavior rather than understanding cause. Throughout all these periods, one pattern remained strong. Women's anxiety was rarely seen as a response to hardship. It was rarely linked to loss, hunger, childbirth, or danger. It was seen as something wrong inside the woman herself. Her mind was not listened to. Her body was corrected. In daily life, women learned to manage anxiety in quiet ways. They prayed. They worked. They leaned on family and neighbors. Formal treatment often ignored their voices, but survival required endurance. Emotional pain became part of ordinary life rather than a problem to be solved. So the history of women's anxiety is not only a history of medicine, it is a history of belief. It shows how societies explained fear and sadness in ways that matched their ideas about women. The goal was not to understand worry. It was to silence it. And as we begin this slow walk through how women's anxiety was treated in history, we see a long pattern of misunderstanding. Feelings that came from pressure and danger were turned into problems of the body or the soul. Treatment aimed to calm, restrain, and control rather than to listen. In this quiet struggle between emotion and explanation, generations of women lived with fear that had no true name and no true comfort. As time moved forward, the ways societies explained women's fear and worry became more closely tied to ideas about control. In many cultures, a calm woman was seen as a proper woman, while an anxious or restless woman was seen as a problem to be fixed. This belief shaped treatment. Instead of asking what caused distress, healers and families focused on making behavior quieter and more acceptable. Anxiety was not treated as a message from life's hardships. It was treated as something that disturbed social order. In the later Middle Ages, European medicine mixed religion with ancient ideas about the body. Women who showed signs of fear, sadness, or panic were often told that their inner balance had been broken by weak faith or sinful thought. Prayer and fasting were common responses. Herbs were used to dull strong feelings. Warm drinks made from poppy, valerian, or other calming plants were given to quiet the nerves. These remedies were meant to soften emotion rather than to explore it. In convents and religious homes, anxious women were guided into silence and routine. Repetition of daily tasks and prayer was believed to settle the mind. For some, this structure may have brought peace. For others, it meant living with fear without words to describe it. Anxiety was absorbed into duty, not healed. During times of plague and war, women's fear grew naturally. They watched children die. They saw hunger spread. They carried grief inside daily work. Yet medicine still explained their distress as weakness rather than response. A woman who cried often or could not sleep was said to have a fragile spirit. Treatment remained focused on rest, herbs, and obedience. By the Renaissance period, medical writing expanded, but old ideas remained strong. Doctors still believed the womb played a central role in women's emotions. If a woman felt anxious, they believed the womb was dry, cold, or unsettled. Treatments aimed to warm or moisten the body. Baths, oils, and scented air were used to guide inner balance. The mind itself was still not seen as the main cause. Wealth shaped treatment deeply. Rich women who felt anxious were kept inside quiet rooms and given special diets. They were told to avoid excitement, strong reading, or public life. Their anxiety was treated with isolation and calm surroundings. Poor women, however, were expected to continue working. Their fear was seen as something that labor would remove. This created two different histories of anxiety based on class. In some parts of the world, traditional medicine offered gentler explanations. In East Asia, fear and worry were linked to blocked energy rather than moral weakness. Treatments focused on breathing, movement, and balance. In India, women who felt distressed were advised to follow gentle routines and eat calming foods. These systems still blamed imbalance, but they did not always blame character. In Europe and later in colonial medicine, a new idea took hold. Women were said to be naturally more emotional than men. This belief made anxiety seem normal for women, and serious only when it became extreme. Doctors wrote that women were ruled by feelings and that fear was part of their nature. Because of this, anxiety was not studied deeply. It was accepted as part of being female. The word hysteria became a powerful label. It grouped fear, sadness, anger, and nervousness into one condition believed to rise from the womb. A woman who worried too much or panicked too easily could be called hysterical. Treatment focused on controlling her body and her routine. Exercise was limited. Rest was enforced. Silence was praised. Some women were sent away from their homes to special houses for nervous patients. These places were meant to protect them from stress, but they often removed them from family and purpose. Anxiety became something that separated women from normal life, rather than something that could be understood within it. Across cultures, one pattern remained. Women's fear was rarely connected to childbirth pain, loss of children, heavy labor, or lack of freedom. These causes were invisible to medicine. Instead, the female body itself was blamed. This made anxiety feel like a flaw rather than a reaction. Inside homes, women developed their own ways of coping. They talked with other women, they prayed. They worked until they were too tired to think. They sang while doing tasks. These quiet methods were not recorded in books, but they were lived every day. Survival depended on finding small peace inside fear. By the early modern period, doctors began to describe nervous illness in more detail, but treatment still aimed at calming rather than understanding. Women were advised to avoid excitement and to keep their minds empty. Strong thought was believed to cause distress. A peaceful woman was seen as a healthy woman. So as history moved forward, anxiety in women remained misunderstood. It was shaped into medical terms that hid its true causes. Fear born from danger and loss was turned into weakness of the body. Treatment focused on quieting rather than healing. And as this second part of our slow walk through the history of women's anxiety settles into calm, we see that the past offered few words for what women felt. Their worry lived inside routine, prayer, and silence. Medicine tried to control it. Society tried to hide it. Yet through all this, women carried on, working and caring while holding fear inside their daily lives. As the early modern world moved closer to what we now call modern medicine, women's anxiety began to receive new names, but not new understanding. Doctors started to speak of nerves rather than spirits, and of weakness rather than sin. Yet the old idea remained strong. Women's fear and worry were still believed to come from inside their bodies rather than from their lives. Anxiety was no longer blamed only on the soul, but it was still blamed on the female form itself. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European doctors described women as naturally delicate and sensitive. They believed that the female body was easily disturbed by emotion, imagination, and thought. If a woman worried too much, it was said that her nerves had become overstimulated. Treatment focused on calming these nerves. Quiet rooms, gentle walks, and bland food were prescribed. Strong feelings were discouraged. A woman who felt fear was taught to suppress it rather than explore it. At the same time, women's daily lives were becoming more restricted in many places. Education for women was limited. Work outside the home was often forbidden or discouraged. Marriage and motherhood were presented as the natural path. Yet these roles carried heavy pressure. Childbirth was dangerous. Child loss was common. Work inside the home was endless and unpaid. Anxiety grew naturally from these conditions, but medicine still refused to see it as a response to hardship. It was seen as a defect of temperament. In wealthy families, anxious women were sometimes placed under the care of private doctors. These doctors often prescribed long periods of rest. The woman was told to stay in bed, avoid visitors, and avoid books or writing. Thinking too deeply was believed to cause distress. Silence and stillness were considered cures. In reality, many women became lonelier and more fearful. Yet this treatment was praised as modern and scientific. Among poor women, anxiety received no such attention. They were expected to work through it. If they felt afraid or restless, they were told to pray harder or labor more. Their fear was treated as weakness of character rather than illness. This created two worlds of anxiety, one hidden in quiet rooms and one buried under work. In the 19th century, doctors began to write more about nervous illness. They described symptoms that closely match what we now call anxiety. Racing heart, shaking, fear without clear cause, sleeplessness, and sudden tears. Yet they still believed these symptoms were tied to womanhood itself. A woman's reproductive system was said to drain her energy and disturb her mind. Men were said to suffer from stress. Women were said to suffer from nature. Some doctors believed that education caused women's anxiety. They claimed that learning and thinking weakened the female body. Girls were warned not to study too much. Reading novels was said to excite the nerves. Writing letters was said to strain the mind. Anxiety was treated by limiting thought rather than by relieving pressure. During this time, the word hysteria became common in hospitals and books. It was used to explain almost any emotional distress in women. Panic, sadness, anger, and fear were placed under one label. Treatment varied widely. Some women were given cold baths to shock the nerves into calm. Others were given warm baths and massages to relax them. Some were made to exercise. Others were made to rest completely. The methods differed, but the goal was always the same: to quiet the woman. Mental hospitals also grew during this period. Women who could not function in daily life were sent away. Inside these places, anxiety was treated with order and routine. Patients rose at set times, worked at set tasks, and slept at set hours. This structure was believed to cure the mind by disciplining it. Some women found peace in this routine. Others felt trapped and unheard. In many cases, women's anxiety was tied to events that medicine ignored. Abuse, loss of children, hunger, and lack of choice all created fear. Yet doctors rarely asked about these experiences. They measured pulse and posture instead. The cause of suffering was sought in organs rather than in life stories. This made anxiety seem mysterious and unfixable. Outside formal medicine, women continued to care for one another. They shared worries in kitchens and courtyards. They passed down calming teas and simple rituals. They sang while working. These acts did not cure anxiety, but they softened it. Community became one of the few treatments available. By the late 19th century, a small shift began. Some thinkers started to argue that the mind itself could become ill. They suggested that fear and worry might come from experience rather than from the womb. This idea was new and slow to grow. Most doctors still believed women were naturally anxious. Yet a door had begun to open toward a different understanding. So during this long period, women's anxiety was renamed but not fully understood. It moved from sin to nerves, from spirits to organs, but it was still treated as something to be silenced. Quietness remained the goal. Not healing, not listening, not change. And as this third part of our slow walk through the history of women's anxiety settles into calm reflection, we see how deeply misunderstanding shaped treatment. Fear born from loss and pressure was turned into a fault of the body. Women were asked to be still when what they needed was to be heard. Their anxiety became a private burden carried through generations, waiting for a time when it would finally be seen as a human response rather than a female flaw. The slow change toward understanding the mind did not arrive suddenly. It crept forward through small shifts in language and practice. Doctors began to notice that fear and restlessness could appear even when the body looked healthy. Some started to write that worry might come from long stress, from grief, or from shock. Yet even as these ideas appeared, women were still described as naturally more fragile. Anxiety in women was explained as something expected, while the same fear in men was described as exhaustion or pressure from work. The difference in treatment stayed firm. As the 20th century approached, new theories about the mind began to grow. Thinkers suggested that hidden memories and buried fears could shape behavior. For the first time, anxiety was linked to past experience rather than only to organs. This change slowly altered treatment. Talking became part of care. Women were asked about their thoughts, their dreams, and their childhoods. Yet these questions were still shaped by old beliefs. A woman's distress was often traced back to her role as daughter, wife, or mother, rather than to danger or injustice. Hospitals and clinics began to separate mental suffering from physical illness. Anxiety was described as nervous disorder rather than womb trouble. Yet the goal of treatment remained calmness. Medicines were used to slow the heart and quiet the body. Rest was still praised. Women were advised to avoid excitement, crowds, and strong emotion. Fear was treated as something that should be smoothed away rather than explored. War changed this pattern in a quiet way. When wars spread across nations, fear touched everyone. Men returned from battle shaking and sleepless. Doctors had to accept that anxiety could come from experience rather than from gender. This slowly weakened the idea that women were anxious by nature. Yet women's fear was still judged differently. A man's fear was linked to trauma. A woman's fear was linked to nerves. During times of economic hardship, women carried heavy worry. They feared for food, for children, and for shelter. Yet medicine still focused on their bodies. Pills were given to quiet the nerves. Long talks about loss or pressure were rare. Anxiety was treated as a condition to manage, not as a story to hear. In families, women were often expected to hide distress to protect others. A calm mother was seen as the center of the home. Fear had no place in that image. This made anxiety more private. Women learned to smile while trembling inside. Treatment happened in bedrooms and clinics away from public view. Fear became something shameful rather than something shared. As psychology grew stronger, new words appeared. Anxiety was separated from sadness. Panic was named. Phobias were described. These words gave shape to feelings that had long existed. Yet women were still described as more likely to suffer. Their emotional lives were still treated as more intense and less controlled. Old ideas did not vanish. They simply wore new clothes. Medicine also introduced stronger drugs. These medicines calmed the body quickly. They slowed breathing and quieted thought. For many women, this meant relief from racing fear. For others, it meant dullness and distance from life. Treatment aimed to remove symptoms rather than to remove causes. The inner world remained unexplored. In many places, therapy became available only to the wealthy. Poor women continued to rely on family, faith, and endurance. Their anxiety was shaped by hunger, labor, and loss. Yet these causes were rarely discussed in treatment rooms. Fear was still seen as personal weakness rather than social pressure. Slowly, voices began to rise that challenged these ideas. Some writers and healers argued that women's anxiety came from limited choices, heavy responsibility, and constant judgment. They said that fear was not illness, but response. This view did not spread quickly, but it planted seeds. It suggested that distress might be a message rather than a flaw. Through all these changes, one pattern remained. Anxiety in women was always shaped by how society viewed women. When women were seen as weak, their fear was seen as weakness. When women were seen as emotional, their fear was seen as nature. Treatment followed belief more than evidence. Medicine reflected culture. Inside homes, women continued to manage anxiety through quiet strength. They kept routines. They shared worries with trusted friends. They held fear while caring for others. These acts were not recorded in medical books, but they were real treatments. They allowed life to continue when official care failed. So the history of women's anxiety is not only a story of doctors and drugs. It is a story of how fear was named, hidden, and controlled. It shows how emotional pain was shaped into something private rather than something understood. It shows how silence became a kind of medicine. And as this long flow of history moves forward, we see that understanding anxiety required more than new words. It required seeing women as full human beings shaped by life's weight. Until that shift began, treatment focused on quieting the surface while leaving the cause untouched. Fear remained, waiting for a time when it would finally be allowed to speak. As new ideas about the mind slowly spread, anxiety in women began to be spoken about more openly. Yet it was still framed through old expectations. Society continued to believe that a woman's duty was to remain steady and calm for the sake of others. When fear appeared, it was treated as something that disrupted order inside the home. Treatment aimed to restore quiet, rather than to explore the reasons behind distress. The goal was not to understand anxiety, but to make it less visible. Doctors increasingly used words like nervousness and tension instead of hysteria, but the meaning remained similar. Women who worried too much were described as sensitive. Their minds were said to react too strongly to ordinary life. Treatment focused on reducing stimulation. Soft light, gentle music, and slow routines were recommended. Emotional distance from troubling events was encouraged. The world was not asked to change. The woman was asked to shrink her response to it. During the early 20th century, new medicines appeared that could slow the heart and calm the body. These drugs were given widely to women who could not sleep or who felt constant fear. For many, this brought relief. For others, it brought heaviness and fog. Anxiety was quieted, but the reasons for it remained. Loss, pressure, and danger were still present in daily life. Medicine treated the symptom, not the source. In families, the burden of worry often rested on women's shoulders. They cared for children, the sick, and the elderly. They managed food and money during hard times. Their fear came from real risk. Yet treatment rarely named these causes. Instead, women were told they were too emotional. Their anxiety was blamed on their nature rather than on their work and responsibility. Psychology slowly began to look at experience instead of only the body. Some healers started to listen to women's stories. They heard about grief, about fear of childbirth, about loneliness and lack of choice. These conversations revealed that anxiety was shaped by life events, yet this understanding spread unevenly. Many doctors still believed that women were simply more anxious by design. Public opinion also shaped treatment. A woman who showed fear openly could be judged as unstable. This made many hide their distress. They learned to smile while shaking inside. Anxiety became something private, carried alone. Treatment happened in quiet rooms, behind closed doors. Fear became a secret rather than a shared condition. In times of social change, anxiety in women often increased. Wars, economic crises, and shifting roles created uncertainty. Women were asked to work more while still caring for families. Their worry grew, but medicine still framed it as weakness. The pressure of new responsibilities was rarely recognized as cause. Anxiety was described as imbalance rather than burden. Religious and cultural ideas continued to influence care. In some communities, anxious women were guided toward prayer and surrender. Calmness was seen as virtue. Fear was seen as lack of faith. This shaped treatment toward silence rather than expression. Emotion was controlled through belief rather than explored through conversation. Over time, the idea that the mind could suffer became stronger. Anxiety was no longer always tied to the womb or to blood. It was tied to thoughts and memory. This opened the door to new forms of care. Talking became treatment. Yet women were still often guided toward acceptance rather than change. Their distress was explained as reaction to their role rather than to injustice. In hospitals and clinics, charts were kept and symptoms recorded. Women's anxiety was measured in sleep lost and pulse raised. These signs were treated with routine and medicine. Rarely was the question asked, "What has happened to you?" The story behind the symptom remained unheard. Outside formal treatment, women continued to support one another. They shared fear while cooking or walking together. They learned which teas eased the stomach and which songs eased the heart. These small acts formed a hidden history of care. They did not remove anxiety, but they softened its edge. Community became a quiet medicine. As society moved forward, some voices began to argue that women's anxiety was shaped by limited freedom. They said fear came from being watched, judged, and controlled. This idea did not replace old beliefs quickly, but it challenged them. It suggested that distress might be a response to pressure rather than a defect of nature. Through all these changes, one truth remained. Anxiety in women was treated according to how women were seen. When women were viewed as fragile, their fear was treated as fragility. When they were viewed as responsible for others, their fear was hidden to protect those around them. Treatment followed belief, not experience. So the story of women's anxiety is a story of silence and adjustment. Fear was calmed, dulled, or hidden. Rarely was it asked why it appeared. Medicine and society worked together to make women quieter rather than to make life safer. And as this slow history continues to unfold, we see that understanding anxiety required more than new drugs or new words. It required seeing women's lives as full of weight and meaning. Until that happened, fear remained something to be managed rather than something to be understood. It stayed inside routines and remedies, waiting for a time when its cause would be recognized as part of human experience rather than as a flaw of the female body. As the modern age moved forward, the way anxiety in women was understood began to shift very slowly, yet old habits still held strong. Doctors started to accept that fear and worry could rise from experience, but they continued to describe women as more likely to feel these things deeply. A woman who showed distress was still seen as fragile, while a man with the same feelings was seen as tired or burdened. Treatment followed this difference. Women were given calming medicine and told to rest, while their lives were rarely examined for the pressures that caused their fear. In many places, hospitals and clinics became the main centers for treatment. Anxiety was now listed in records and given names. Yet these names did not change the goal of care. The aim was still to reduce visible symptoms. Fast breathing, shaking hands, and sleepless nights were quieted with pills or strict routines. Fear itself was not explored. It was managed like pain, something to be dulled rather than understood. At the same time, women's roles were changing. More women worked outside the home. More were responsible for both income and family care. This double burden created new kinds of stress. Worry about safety, money, and children filled daily life. Yet when women spoke of fear, medicine still treated it as imbalance of the nerves. The weight of responsibility was rarely named as cause. Anxiety was still seen as something inside the woman rather than something around her. During times of war and recovery, fear became part of everyday existence. Women waited for news of husbands and sons. They worked in factories and hospitals. They managed households under shortage and danger. Their anxiety grew from real threats. Yet treatment still focused on calming rather than explaining. Fear caused by danger was treated as nervous weakness rather than as natural response. New schools of thought began to suggest that childhood and memory shaped the mind. Women who felt anxious were asked about their early lives. This brought new language to distress. Yet even these ideas were shaped by old beliefs. A woman's fear was often linked to her family role, her emotions, and her relationships, rather than to power or freedom. Her inner world was examined, but the outer world was still ignored. Medicine also began to classify different kinds of anxiety. Panic, worry, and tension were separated into categories. This helped describe what women felt, but it also turned fear into something technical and distant. Charts replaced stories. Numbers replaced voices. Treatment became more organized but not always more humane. Women were still often told what to feel rather than asked why they felt it. In daily life, anxiety continued to be hidden. A woman who admitted fear could be judged as unstable. This made many keep silent. They smiled in public and worried in private. Treatment happened in secret. Pills were taken quietly. Fear was managed behind closed doors. This silence shaped generations. Anxiety became something personal rather than something shared. Religious and moral ideas continued to influence care. In some communities, calmness was praised as virtue. Fear was seen as lack of faith or strength. Women were guided toward patience and surrender. These ideas did not remove anxiety, but they taught women to carry it quietly. Endurance became part of identity. Gradually, some voices began to argue that anxiety was not weakness but reaction. They said that fear came from danger, loss, and pressure. They said women's anxiety grew from being watched, limited, and judged. This idea did not replace older views quickly, but it offered a different path. It suggested that treatment should change the conditions of life, not only the feelings inside it. Despite these new thoughts, medicine continued to focus on control. Drugs became stronger. They calmed the mind more deeply. For some women, this meant relief from constant fear. For others, it meant feeling distant from themselves. Anxiety was softened, but its message was lost. Treatment still aimed at quiet, not at meaning. Across cultures, women continued to create their own ways of coping. They talked with friends, prayed, walked, and worked. They learned which habits eased the chest and which worsened it. These quiet practices formed another history of anxiety, one that did not appear in medical books. It was passed through families and friendships, not through clinics. So the story of women's anxiety during this period is one of change mixed with delay. New words appeared, but old beliefs remained. Fear was named more clearly, but it was still treated as something to be controlled. The causes of anxiety in women's lives were still hidden behind ideas about nature and emotion. And as this long flow of history continues, we see that treatment has always followed belief. When women were seen as weak, their fear was treated as weakness. When they were seen as emotional, their fear was treated as excess feeling. True understanding required a new way of seeing women themselves, not only new ways of calming their minds. Until that change took root, anxiety remained something to silence rather than something to listen to, carried quietly through daily life like an invisible weight. As the years moved on, the slow effort to understand fear began to turn toward everyday life rather than only toward clinics and books. More people started to notice that anxiety rose and fell with work. with family pressure, and with sudden change. Women who carried many roles at once felt the strain most clearly. They were expected to be calm at home, careful with children, and steady in times of trouble. When worry appeared, it was still treated as something to smooth over. Yet its connection to responsibility became harder to ignore. Education for women expanded in some places, and with it came new ways to speak about inner life. Letters, journals, and quiet conversations began to describe feelings of constant worry and restlessness. These writings showed that anxiety was not rare and not simple. It was tied to loss, to fear of the future, and to the pressure to appear strong. Yet even as these voices appeared, official treatment continued to focus on keeping behavior orderly. Calmness remained the sign of health. Work outside the home added another layer. Women who labored in factories or offices returned to homes where care and duty still waited. Their bodies carried fatigue. Their minds carried worry. Medicine often described this as nervous strain. Treatment involved rest and sedatives rather than change in workload. Fear caused by long hours and low control was treated as imbalance inside the woman, not imbalance in her life. During periods of social upheaval, anxiety spread quietly. Economic hardship, political unrest, and sudden loss of stability created uncertainty. Women felt this deeply because they often held families together during crisis. Their fear came from watching resources shrink and futures darken. Yet treatment still centered on calming symptoms. Worry born from real danger was treated as personal weakness. Psychological ideas continued to grow. Some healers suggested that anxiety was shaped by memory and expectation. They asked women to speak about what frightened them. These conversations brought new language to old pain. Yet the setting of these talks often remained unequal. A woman's fear was examined as something inside her mind rather than as something created by her position in the world. The story was heard, but the structure around it was not questioned. In many communities, women learned to manage anxiety through rhythm. They kept routines. They repeated tasks that brought order to the day. Cooking, cleaning, and caring became ways to quiet racing thought. These acts did not remove fear, but they gave it shape and limits. Anxiety was held inside work rather than expressed openly. This made daily life a kind of treatment. Faith also continued to play a role. Calmness was praised as virtue. Trust was taught as medicine. Women were guided to place their fear in prayer and surrender. For some, this brought peace. For others, it turned fear inward. Anxiety became something to hide from others and from oneself. Silence was seen as strength. Medical language changed again. New terms described stress and tension. Women were said to suffer from overload of feeling. The idea that emotion itself caused illness remained strong. Treatment still aimed at dulling sensation rather than changing circumstance. Pills and routines became tools of control rather than tools of understanding. At the same time, small shifts appeared in public thought. Some began to say that constant worry might come from being watched, judged, and limited. They suggested that fear was not always illness. It was sometimes a signal that life was too narrow or too heavy. This idea did not become dominant quickly, but it offered another path. It allowed anxiety to be seen as reaction rather than defect. Inside families, women continued to share fear in quiet ways. They spoke while working or walking. They warned one another about exhaustion and grief. These small exchanges formed a network of care outside official treatment. They did not remove anxiety, but they prevented complete isolation. Community became a soft answer where medicine offered only silence. So during this period, anxiety in women remained shaped by how society viewed women's place. When women were expected to carry everything, their fear grew. When they were expected to be calm, their fear was hidden. Treatment followed these expectations rather than challenging them. The goal was still order, not insight. And as this long movement through history continues, we see that understanding anxiety required more than naming it. It required seeing the conditions that produced it. Until those conditions were questioned, fear remained something to manage rather than something to explain. Women carried their worry through work, faith, and routine, waiting for a time when their distress would be seen not as excess emotion, but as a natural response to a life filled with weight and duty. As understanding of the mind slowly widened, the idea that anxiety could come from long pressure rather than sudden shock began to take root. Women who lived with constant responsibility felt this most clearly. They carried worry for children, for aging parents, and for the stability of the home. This steady tension did not look dramatic, so it was often ignored. Yet it shaped sleep, appetite, and breath. Medicine still described these signs as nervous trouble, but daily life revealed a deeper cause. Fear was growing from years of holding everything together. In many places, health advice turned toward control of habits. Women were told to walk slowly, to eat lightly, and to avoid news or excitement. Calm surroundings were prescribed as if the world itself could be kept quiet. These instructions assumed that fear came from too much feeling rather than from too much demand. A woman was taught to narrow her world to protect her nerves. Her anxiety was treated by shrinking her life rather than by easing her burden. Public health movements encouraged cleanliness, order, and routine. These ideas entered homes and shaped women's lives. A well-run household was seen as proof of health. When anxiety appeared, it was said that routine had been broken. Treatment focused on restoring order through schedules and rules. Worry was not asked about, it was managed through structure. In schools and training centers for nurses and caregivers, women were taught to hide emotion. Calm faces were seen as signs of skill. Fear was something to control, not something to show. This teaching moved into family life as well. A good mother was expected to be steady even when she felt afraid. Anxiety became a private feeling rather than a shared one. New medicines became more common and more powerful. They could slow thought and soften fear quickly. Doctors used them to help women sleep and to stop shaking and panic. For many, this was a relief. Yet these medicines also made feelings less sharp. They quieted the mind without explaining it. Anxiety was covered, not uncovered. The question of why fear existed remained unasked. In working communities, women faced dangers that were rarely discussed. Long hours, unsafe conditions, and low pay created constant stress. Mothers worried about food and rent. Daughters worried about the future. These fears were not treated as social problems. They were treated as personal weakness. Pills and rest were offered where safety and fairness were needed. Cultural stories continued to shape treatment. Women were described as more emotional, more sensitive, and more easily disturbed. These stories made fear seem natural rather than meaningful. If anxiety was natural, it did not need explanation. It only needed control. This belief kept attention away from the real sources of distress. Slowly, Some doctors and thinkers began to notice that anxiety often appeared alongside loss and change. Women who lost children, partners, or homes showed deep worry. Their fear followed events, rather than appearing without cause. This observation challenged the idea that anxiety was only inside the body. It suggested that fear was tied to memory and future uncertainty. Yet this idea took time to be accepted. In families, women continued to create small spaces of calm. They used music, prayer, and repeated tasks to quiet their thoughts. They leaned on trusted friends and relatives. These methods did not cure anxiety, but they allowed life to continue. Community acted as a shield where medicine was distant or limited. In cities, anonymity increased. Women felt alone even among many people. Their fear had fewer places to go. Clinics became one of the only spaces where worry could be named. Yet the language used there was technical. It spoke of symptoms rather than stories. Fear was turned into a condition instead of a response. Through all these changes, the main goal of treatment remained the same: to make anxiety less visible. Calmness was praised. Quietness was rewarded. Women learned that fear should not disturb others. They learned to carry it without sound. This shaped how anxiety was lived. It became inward and silent. Yet beneath this silence, a new idea was forming. Some began to say that fear had meaning. They suggested that anxiety pointed to problems in work, family, and freedom. They said that worry was not only illness, it was also message. This idea did not erase old treatment, but it planted doubt. It allowed anxiety to be seen as something to learn from rather than something to erase. So as history continued to move forward, women's anxiety stood between two views. One saw it as weakness to be quieted. The other began to see it as reaction to life's weight. Treatment moved slowly from control toward listening, but the change was uneven and incomplete. Many women still received care that dulled feeling rather than explored it. And as this long story flows onward, we see that the way anxiety was treated always reflected how women were seen. When women were expected to endure, their fear was hidden. When they were expected to be calm, their fear was silenced. True care required a different question. Not how to stop fear, but what fear was trying to say. Until that question became central, anxiety remained something to manage rather than something to understand, carried quietly through the rhythms of daily life. As these ideas slowly spread, the meaning of care itself began to shift, though not in a straight line. Some healers started to believe that fear could not be separated from the life a woman lived. They noticed that anxiety rose when duties increased and fell when safety returned. Yet even with this awareness, treatment still focused on the surface of distress. A trembling body was calmed. A racing heart was slowed. The deeper causes were left in place like roots under quiet soil. In many households, women continued to hold together the fragile balance between work and care. They managed food, children, and sickness, often with little help. Their worry was not sudden. It was constant. It came from knowing that one mistake could mean hunger or loss. This kind of fear did not look like panic. It looked like sleepless nights and tight breath while working. Medicine still named it nervousness, as if it were a passing condition rather than a daily state. Health advice in this period often told women to avoid thinking too much. Heavy thought was believed to strain the nerves. Books, news, and serious conversation were said to excite the mind. Calmness was created by narrowing attention. Women were encouraged to focus on simple tasks and quiet spaces. This did not remove danger from their lives. It only reduced how much they were allowed to speak about it. Anxiety was managed by limiting awareness rather than by changing reality. Public discussions of fear began to appear in new forms of writing. Magazines and pamphlets spoke about nervous women and delicate minds. These writings describe symptoms, but rarely describe the lives behind them. Fear was shown as a personal weakness. This shaped how women saw themselves. Many began to believe that worry meant they were flawed rather than burdened. Anxiety became part of identity instead of part of circumstance. In places where factory work and crowded housing grew, women faced new kinds of pressure. Noise, smoke, and long hours created constant strain. Mothers worried about children playing near machines and streets. Their fear was shaped by visible danger, yet treatment still aimed at the body. Tonic drinks, rest days, and calming powders were offered. The environment remained unchanged. Fear was treated as internal rather than as response to risk. Medical language became more exact. Terms were used to describe different patterns of worry. Some women were said to suffer from constant tension, others from sudden fear. These categories helped doctors organize care, but they also made anxiety seem separate from life. Fear was placed in lists and charts. The story behind it was rarely recorded. A woman's worry was reduced to a name. At the same time, new conversations about the mind suggested that long-held fear could shape thought itself. Women who had lived through loss or violence often carried anxiety into later years. Their fear did not fade with time. It became part of how they expected the world to behave. This observation hinted that anxiety could be learned from experience, yet treatment still focused on calming the present rather than healing the past. In families, women learned to protect others from their fear. A worried mother hid her distress so children would not see it. A wife kept calm so a husband would not feel more pressure. Anxiety was shaped into quietness. It became a private struggle rather than a shared one. This made it stronger, not weaker. Fear that cannot be spoken grows heavier. Community support remained one of the few ways anxiety could be softened. Women gathered while working, walking, or caring for children. They spoke of small worries and large ones. These conversations did not remove danger, but they gave fear a place to rest. Shared worry became lighter than silent worry. This form of care did not appear in medical records, yet it shaped survival. Religious and moral ideas continued to frame fear as something to overcome through patience. Calmness was praised. Endurance was honored. Women were taught that strength meant carrying fear without complaint. This teaching gave meaning to suffering, but it also hid its cause. Anxiety became a test rather than a signal. It was something to pass through rather than something to question. Slowly, some thinkers argued that constant worry might be connected to lack of control over one's life. They suggested that anxiety grew where choice was limited and judgment was constant. This idea challenged the belief that fear came from nature alone. It pointed outward toward work, family rules, and social pressure. Yet this view remained quiet compared to older explanations. Most treatments still aimed inward. Medicine continued to rely on tools that quieted the body. Pills, rest, and routine were the main answers. These tools could ease pain for a time, but they did not remove the weight that caused it. Anxiety became something to live with rather than something to resolve. Women learned to adjust themselves to fear rather than to change the conditions that created it. Across all these changes, one truth stayed clear. The way anxiety was treated followed how women were seen. When women were expected to hold families together, their fear was hidden. When they were seen as sensitive, their fear was dismissed. Treatment did not grow from women's experience, it grew from society's image of them. So the history of women's anxiety during this period is a history of quiet endurance. Fear was shaped into silence. It was dulled with medicine and masked with routine. Rarely was it asked what life had done to create it. The body was calmed. The mind was ordered. The world remained the same. And as this long path continues forward, we see that anxiety was never only a medical condition. It was a reflection of how women lived. It carried the marks of duty, danger, and expectation. Until these forces were named, fear remained something to control rather than something to understand, moving through generations like a low, steady wind that shaped lives without ever being seen. As this long pattern continued, a quiet change began to appear in how fear was spoken about, even if it was not yet fully accepted. Some doctors and writers started to suggest that anxiety might be connected to how much control a person had over their own life. Women who lived under constant judgment, who carried responsibility without authority, and who faced danger without protection, showed signs of worry that did not fade. Their fear did not come from imagination. It came from watching the future feel uncertain every day. Yet even as this idea appeared, treatment remained focused on adjustment rather than change. Women were encouraged to adapt themselves to stress instead of reducing the stress itself. They were told to sleep more, to think less, and to remain calm. These instructions assumed that the problem lived inside the woman. Her world did not need to be altered. Her reactions did. Anxiety was shaped into something personal rather than something social. In homes, fear often grew from silence. Women were expected to manage emotion quietly so others would not be disturbed. A worried mother did not speak of her fear to children. A tired wife did not speak of her fear to her husband. Anxiety became something held inside, like breath held too long. Over time, this silence turned into habit. Fear without words became heavier than fear shared. Medical care continued to use the language of balance. The nervous system was said to be overstimulated. Hormones were said to be unsettled. Treatments aimed to smooth these systems through medication and routine. These tools could ease shaking hands and racing hearts. They could bring sleep to restless nights. But they did not ask what caused the mind to race in the first place. The body was treated as if it were the source, not the messenger. In places where women entered new kinds of work, anxiety changed shape. Fear of injury, fear of loss of income, and fear of judgment followed them into factories and offices. Their worry was shaped by noise, speed, and strict schedules. Yet treatment still described these fears as inner weakness. The workplace was not blamed. The woman was told to rest or to calm her nerves. New forms of therapy appeared that encouraged talking about thoughts and feelings. Some women found relief in speaking their fears aloud. Naming worry gave it shape. It no longer floated without meaning. Yet these spaces were limited. They were often available only to those with money and time. For many women, anxiety remained untreated except through endurance. Cultural ideas continued to shape what fear meant. A woman who worried too much could be called dramatic or unstable. This made anxiety something shameful. Women learned to measure their words carefully. They shared fear only with those they trusted deeply. Public calm became a mask worn every day. Anxiety lived behind that mask, growing stronger through concealment. In times of rapid change, fear increased. New machines, new laws, and new expectations created uncertainty. Women were asked to adapt quickly while still caring for families. Their anxiety was shaped by this constant adjustment. Medicine still described it as nervous trouble rather than as strain from change. Fear caused by unstable life was treated as unstable personality. Some thinkers began to argue that worry was a form of knowledge. They suggested that anxiety showed where danger lay. A woman who feared hunger knew hunger was near. A woman who feared loss knew loss had touched her life before. This idea reframed anxiety as signal rather than flaw. It did not remove fear, but it changed its meaning. Fear became something to learn from rather than something to erase. Still, treatment largely followed the older path. Calmness was praised, quiet was rewarded. Medicine worked to dull sensation. Fear was kept under control so daily life could continue. Women learned to function with anxiety rather than without it. Their strength was measured by how well they hid distress. Community continued to offer a softer answer. Women spoke to one another while working or walking. They shared worries about children, money, and safety. These conversations did not solve the causes of fear, but they reduced its loneliness. Anxiety carried alone became anxiety carried together. This sharing was one of the few ways fear was acknowledged without being judged. Religion and moral teaching still shaped responses. Endurance was seen as virtue. Calmness was linked to goodness. Fear was framed as something to overcome through patience. This gave meaning to distress, but did not remove its source. Anxiety became part of character rather than part of circumstance. Through all of this, one pattern remained steady. Women's anxiety was treated in ways that matched how women were expected to live. When they were expected to hold families together, their fear was hidden. When they were expected to be gentle, their fear was softened. Treatment aimed to keep order rather than to change conditions. Fear was managed so life could go on. So the history of women's anxiety during this long stretch of time is a history of control and adaptation. Fear was quieted, dulled, and shaped into routine. Rarely was it allowed to question the world that created it. Medicine and culture worked together to make anxiety invisible rather than understood. And as this flow of history continues forward, we see that anxiety was never only an illness. It was a reflection of pressure, loss, and uncertainty. Until those roots were seen clearly, treatment could only reach the surface. Women learned to live with worry as part of daily life, carrying it through work, care, and silence, waiting for a time when fear would be recognized not as weakness, but as the voice of a life lived under constant weight. As these ideas continued to move forward, the space between fear and explanation grew wider and more visible. Some women began to notice that their anxiety rose when they were watched closely and fell when they were free to choose their own pace. This pattern suggested that fear was not only inside the body, it was shaped by how much control a person had over their own life. Yet even with this awareness, treatment still focused on calming the individual rather than changing the conditions that caused distress. In many homes, anxiety became part of the rhythm of daily care. Women worried while preparing meals, while waiting for children to return, and while counting money that never seemed enough. Their fear was steady rather than sudden. It did not come as one strong moment. It came as a long tightening inside the chest that never fully left. Medicine still described this as nervous tension. It was treated with tonics and rest days, as if fear were a tired muscle rather than a response to constant pressure. Advice manuals for women often praised stillness and obedience. They taught that peace came from accepting one's role without complaint. When anxiety appeared, it was said that the woman had lost balance in her thoughts. Treatment aimed to return her to quiet habits. Walking, sewing, and gentle music were recommended. Strong opinions and strong feelings were discouraged. Fear was shaped into calm behavior, not into understanding. In places where women's education increased, a new kind of worry appeared. Women learned to think about futures that were closed to them. Knowledge widened their view, but did not widen their choices. Anxiety grew from this distance between thought and action. Medicine still framed this fear as mental strain rather than as frustration. The mind was blamed for reaching too far instead of the world for offering too little. Work continued to change women's lives. Machines replaced hand labor. Time became measured by clocks rather than by daylight. Women were expected to move faster while remaining careful. Their fear followed this speed. Mistakes meant loss of income or loss of safety. Anxiety became tied to time itself. Yet treatment still slowed the body rather than slowing the world. Pills and rest were given where fairness and safety were needed. Family roles also shifted. Women were told to be both strong and gentle, both productive and calm. These opposite demands created constant tension. A woman who worried was told she was too sensitive. A woman who did not worry was told she was careless. Anxiety became trapped between expectation and judgment. Treatment aimed to smooth this tension by quieting emotion rather than by questioning the demand. Some healers began to write that anxiety could come from long-held fear of losing control. Women who lived under rules made by others felt this most strongly. Their worry did not come from imagination. It came from knowing that one wrong step could bring punishment or shame. This idea hinted that anxiety was linked to power rather than to weakness. Yet this view remained small and slow to spread. In hospitals, records of anxious women grew longer. Symptoms were counted, sleep was measured, breathing was noted. Yet the stories behind these signs were rarely written down. A woman's fear of poverty or violence did not fit neatly into charts. It was easier to describe her pulse than her life. Treatment stayed focused on what could be measured, not on what could be understood. Outside formal care, women continued to rely on one another. They spoke while working and while walking. They shared worries about children, money, and safety. These conversations did not remove danger, but they gave fear a place to go. Anxiety spoken aloud became lighter than anxiety held alone. Community became a quiet medicine when official care remained distant. Cultural stories continued to shape how fear was seen. A calm woman was praised as wise. A fearful woman was described as weak. These stories made many hide their distress. They learned to act peaceful while feeling uneasy inside. Anxiety became part of inner life rather than part of public speech. It was carried silently through days and years. Religious teaching still framed fear as something to endure. Patience was praised. Surrender was honored. Women were guided to see anxiety as a test of faith. This gave meaning to distress, but did not remove its cause. Fear became something to bear rather than something to change. Treatment followed belief, not experience. Over time, a slow question began to appear in quiet corners of thought. What if anxiety was not a flaw of the woman, but a sign of what she carried? What if fear pointed to danger, loss, and pressure, rather than to weakness? This question did not yet guide most treatment, but it waited beneath the surface. It challenged the long habit of silence. So the history of women's anxiety during this part of time is a history of endurance shaped into routine. Fear was managed through habits, medicine, and belief. It was not yet seen as a message from life's weight. Treatment aimed to make women calmer, rather than to make their lives safer. And as this slow movement through history continues, we see that anxiety remained tied to how women were expected to live. When they were asked to carry much, they feared much. When they were asked to remain quiet, their fear became hidden. True understanding required seeing anxiety not as excess feeling, but as a response to long responsibility and limited choice. Until that change arrived, fear stayed inside daily life, moving quietly with every task and every breath, waiting to be understood. Over long stretches of time, the idea that fear might come from a woman's surroundings rather than from her nature began to grow more quietly beneath the surface of accepted belief. Women who lived through repeated loss, who watched children fall ill, who feared hunger or judgment, showed patterns of worry that did not fade with rest or routine. Their anxiety followed the shape of their lives. Yet treatment still focused on calming the body instead of easing the weight carried by the mind. In many households, fear became part of careful planning. Women worried about storing food, about keeping fires burning, about protecting children from sickness. This worry did not appear as sudden panic. It appeared as constant attention. The mind never fully rested. Medicine still named this state nervous tension. It was treated with teas, powders, and advice to avoid strong feeling. The cause of fear remained unnamed. It was easier to quiet symptoms than to change conditions. Advice given to women continued to praise order. A well-arranged home was believed to bring peace of mind. Clean floors, quiet rooms, and steady schedules were said to cure unrest. Anxiety was treated as disorder rather than as warning. When fear appeared, it was said that routine had been broken. The answer was to restore routine, not to ask why the heart had begun to race. In places where women's work grew more visible, their fear changed shape. Long hours and close supervision created tension. Mistakes could bring loss of income or punishment. Worry followed these risks. Yet treatment still spoke of sensitive nerves rather than unsafe labor. Fear caused by pressure was treated as weakness of temperament. New forms of care began to appear that focused on conversation. Some healers believed that speaking about fear could reduce its hold. Women were invited to describe their thoughts and dreams. These talks gave shape to feelings that had long been hidden. Yet even here, the goal was often to make the woman adjust to her world rather than to change the world around her. Anxiety was softened through words, but its roots remained. Public ideas about women continued to shape this process. A calm woman was seen as proper. A worried woman was seen as troubled. This made many hide distress behind steady faces. Fear became something that lived inside rather than something that could be shared openly. Treatment followed this pattern. It aimed to protect appearance rather than to protect inner life. In times of illness and loss, women's anxiety deepened. They cared for the sick and prepared the dead. Their fear came from knowing how easily life could change. Yet medicine still named this fear imbalance. It was treated with sleep and quiet. Grief was blended with anxiety, and both were dulled. The line between sorrow and sickness was not clearly drawn. Cultural belief continued to praise endurance. Women were taught that strength meant continuing despite fear. Calmness was linked to goodness. To worry too much was seen as failure of character. This teaching shaped treatment toward control rather than understanding. Fear was something to overcome rather than something to explain. Slowly, the idea that the mind could be shaped by long pressure gained more ground. Some began to notice that women who lived with constant watchfulness showed lasting anxiety. Their fear did not vanish when danger passed. It stayed as memory of danger. This observation hinted that anxiety could be learned through experience. Yet this idea remained quiet compared to older explanations about weakness and nature. In families, women continued to rely on one another. They shared worry while cooking, walking, and caring for children. These moments of speech did not erase fear, but they made it lighter. Anxiety that was spoken became easier to carry than anxiety held alone. Community acted as a form of care when medicine did not listen. Across different lands, similar patterns appeared. Women who lived with little control over their future showed constant unease. Their fear was shaped by uncertainty, yet treatment remained focused on the individual body. Pills, routines, and rest were offered where safety and choice were needed. Anxiety was treated as personal trouble rather than as shared condition. The language of medicine grew more complex, but its direction stayed narrow. Symptoms were divided into kinds of worry. Sleep loss was counted. Breath was measured. These signs were treated carefully. The story behind them was still rarely asked. A woman's fear of losing her home or her child did not fit neatly into medical notes. It was easier to describe her pulse than her life. Religion and moral teaching continued to frame fear as something to endure with patience. Trust was praised. Calmness was honored. Women learned to carry worry as part of duty. This gave fear meaning, but it also kept it hidden. Anxiety became part of identity rather than part of circumstance. Through all these layers, one truth remained steady. The way women's anxiety was treated followed the way women were expected to live. When they were asked to be quiet, their fear was quieted. When they were asked to be strong, their fear was hidden. Treatment aimed to shape behavior rather than to shape conditions. Fear was managed so daily life could continue without disturbance. So the long history of women's anxiety moved forward as a story of adjustment. New words appeared, but old habits remained. Fear was named, but not fully understood. Medicine worked to calm the surface while leaving the depths untouched. Women learned to move through their days with worry woven into work, care, and silence. And as this steady flow of history continues, anxiety remains a reflection of the lives women lived. It carried the marks of duty, loss, and limited choice. Until these marks were seen clearly, treatment could only reach what was visible. Fear stayed close to daily life, moving with each task and each breath, waiting for a time when it would be recognized not as excess emotion, but as a natural response to a life shaped by constant responsibility. With the passing of more years, the idea that fear might be shaped by long exposure to danger began to settle more firmly into thought, even if it did not yet guide most care. Women who lived through repeated loss learned to expect loss again. Their minds stayed alert even when the moment was calm. This watchfulness was not sudden panic. It was a steady readiness for trouble. Medicine still described this as nervous condition, but life itself showed that it grew from memory and habit rather than from weakness. In many households, anxiety became part of careful order. Women planned meals with fear of shortage in mind. They checked doors and fires with fear of harm in mind. Their worry kept the home running. Yet this usefulness of fear was never named. Instead, it was treated as excess. When a woman felt restless or could not sleep, she was told her nerves were too active. The work that made those nerves active was not questioned. Advice given to women continued to praise modest feeling. Strong emotion was said to disturb balance. Quietness was linked with health. When fear appeared, women were guided toward stillness. They were told to breathe slowly, to sit in silence, and to avoid troubling thoughts. These acts could soften anxiety for a time, but they did not remove the dangers that caused it. Calm was taught as skill, while safety remained uncertain. In places where women's labor became more visible, anxiety followed risk. Work near machines, fires, or heavy loads created constant alertness. A mistake could mean injury. Fear stayed close to attention. Yet treatment still named this fear sensitivity rather than caution. The body was treated. The risk was accepted as normal. Anxiety became something to endure rather than something to reduce. Medical writing grew more detailed. Patterns of worry were grouped and described. Some women were said to suffer from constant tension, others from sudden fear. These descriptions gave shape to experience, but they also separated fear from its cause. Once anxiety had a name, it could be treated without asking why it appeared. Language created distance between feeling and life. At the same time, small spaces of listening began to open. Some healers asked women to speak about what frightened them. These talks revealed stories of hunger, loss, and judgment. For the first time, fear was sometimes linked to events rather than to nature. Yet this link remained fragile. Many still believed that women's minds were easily unsettled by their own thoughts. Responsibility was placed back on the individual rather than on circumstance. Public image continued to shape private life. A woman who worried openly could be seen as unstable. This made fear something to hide. Women learned to move through markets and meetings with calm faces while their thoughts ran fast inside. Anxiety became inward. It lived behind polite speech and careful posture. Treatment aimed to protect this appearance of calm rather than to change the inner state. Family roles reinforced this pattern. A woman was expected to be the steady center of the home. Her fear could not disturb others. When worry rose, she carried it alone. Medicine supported this silence by offering pills and routines instead of space to speak. Anxiety was treated as private trouble rather than shared burden. Cultural teaching still praised endurance. Strength was defined as the ability to continue without complaint. Fear was framed as something to rise above. This gave honor to suffering, but it also hid its cause. Anxiety became a mark of character rather than a mark of experience. Women were taught to manage fear rather than to question what created it. Slowly, the idea that long pressure could shape the mind became harder to deny. Women who lived under constant watch or constant work showed lasting worry even when danger passed. Their fear had learned the shape of their lives. This suggested that anxiety could be built by time itself. Treatment, however, still focused on calming the present moment rather than healing the past. In daily life, women continued to use small methods of relief. They walked, prayed, sang, and spoke quietly with trusted friends. These acts did not remove fear, but they gave it space to rest. Anxiety shared became lighter than anxiety carried alone. Community softened what medicine could not reach. Across different lands, the same pattern appeared. Where women lived with limited choice, worry was strong. Where their work and care were heavy, fear was steady. Yet treatment continued to speak of nerves rather than of limits. Pills and advice were offered where freedom and safety were needed. Anxiety remained something to adjust to rather than something to resolve. The language of care grew more exact, but the heart of treatment stayed the same. Calmness was the goal. Quiet was success. Fear was measured by how well it could be hidden. Women learned to function with anxiety rather than to be free of it. Their lives continued, shaped by routines that held worry inside them. So the history of women's anxiety during this long stretch shows a slow movement toward recognition without full change. Fear was described more clearly, but its roots were still rarely touched. Medicine became better at naming symptoms, but not at naming causes. Culture continued to ask women to adapt rather than to be protected. And as this long flow continues, we see that anxiety was never only a medical matter. It was a reflection of how women were asked to live. It carried the marks of duty, risk, and expectation. Until those marks were seen as part of the problem, fear remained something to manage rather than something to understand, woven quietly into work, care, and daily breath. As this slow movement of thought continued, the way fear was explained began to rest more heavily on ideas about responsibility, rather than on ideas about illness alone. Women who worried were often those who carried the most unseen work. They watched over children, guarded food, and kept homes steady in uncertain times. Their anxiety was not sudden or dramatic. It was steady and quiet, shaped by the knowledge that small mistakes could bring large harm. Yet treatment still spoke of nerves and imbalance, as if fear came from the body instead of from the weight of duty. In many communities, advice to anxious women focused on teaching them to control their reactions. They were told to keep regular hours, to avoid troubling news, and to surround themselves with calm objects. Fear was treated as something that grew when attention grew too wide. The answer was to narrow the mind. This did not remove danger from their lives. It only taught them to look away from it. Anxiety became something to manage through avoidance rather than through change. Medical writing of this time grew more confident in describing inner states. It spoke of worry that never rested and of hearts that beat too fast. These descriptions made anxiety visible in books, but not in policy or protection. A woman's fear of hunger or loss was still not treated as reason for concern. It was treated as personal distress. The language of care stayed inside the body, even when the cause lay outside it. Work and care remained tightly joined. A woman who feared for her children's future was often also the one who worked hardest to secure it. Her anxiety became part of her effort. It kept her alert and cautious. Yet this useful side of fear was never named. Instead, it was seen as weakness. Treatment aimed to soften it, even when it helped her survive. Family life continued to demand calmness. A worried mother was believed to pass fear to her children. Because of this, women learned to hide distress behind steady faces. Anxiety became something that lived behind doors and inside thoughts. Medicine supported this hiding by offering quieting remedies instead of listening. Fear was managed in silence. In places where laws and customs limited women's movement and choice, anxiety followed these limits closely. A woman who could not leave a harmful home or unsafe job lived with constant watchfulness. Her fear was not imagination, it was knowledge, yet treatment still named it nervousness rather than captivity. The cause of fear was not addressed. The feeling was dulled instead. Cultural stories continued to praise patience. Women who endured worry without complaint were admired. Fear was turned into virtue through silence. This teaching gave meaning to suffering, but it also kept it hidden. Anxiety became something to be carried well rather than something to be questioned. New forms of talking care slowly appeared, where women could describe their thoughts. These spaces allowed fear to be spoken. Yet even here, the focus was often on changing thought rather than changing life. A woman was guided to see danger as smaller rather than being protected from it. Anxiety was softened through belief rather than through safety. Records from hospitals and clinics show long lists of symptoms. Sleeplessness, shaking, and tight breath were carefully noted. These signs were treated with routine and medicine. Rarely did these records include the story of hunger, loss, or control that shaped them. Fear was made into a pattern of signs rather than a story of living. Outside official care, women continued to rely on small human supports. They walked together, spoke together, and prayed together. These acts did not solve the causes of anxiety, but they reduced loneliness. Shared fear was easier to carry than silent fear. Community remained one of the few places where anxiety could rest without being judged. Across different regions, the same shape of treatment appeared. Calmness was rewarded, quiet was praised. Fear was treated as something that disturbed order. Women learned to measure their worth by how well they hid distress. Anxiety became part of the private self rather than part of public life. Slowly, the idea that fear might be a response to long pressure rather than a flaw of character grew stronger. Some began to say that anxiety pointed to lives lived without safety or choice. This idea did not yet change most treatment, but it waited beneath the surface. It challenged the habit of silence. So during this part of history, women's anxiety remained tied to expectation. When women were asked to hold families together, their fear grew with that task. When they were asked to appear calm, their fear was pushed inward. Treatment aimed to keep life running smoothly rather than to make it lighter. And as this steady flow continues, we see that anxiety followed the shape of women's lives. It rose where danger and duty met. It settled where choice was small and watchfulness was large. Until those conditions were named, care could only quiet the surface. Fear stayed close to daily life, moving with every task and every responsibility, waiting to be understood, not as weakness, but as the voice of long and careful survival. As this long path of belief and practice comes gently toward its end, one quiet pattern becomes clear. For centuries, fear in women was treated as something that needed to be controlled rather than understood. It was named in many ways and softened with many tools, yet its deeper meaning was rarely explored. Anxiety followed women through changing ages because the conditions of their lives kept changing while their voices remained small. Worry rose where safety was uncertain and where responsibility was heavy. Treatment tried to make fear less visible so daily life could continue. Across ancient worlds and modern ones, medicine reflected how women were seen. When women were described as delicate, their fear was treated as delicacy. When they were expected to endure, their fear was hidden behind endurance. The tools changed from herbs to routines to pills and conversations, but the purpose stayed close to the same. Calmness was valued more than truth. Quiet was valued more than understanding. Fear was shaped into something private instead of something shared. Yet beneath these layers of silence, women kept finding ways to live with their anxiety. They worked, prayed, walked, and spoke softly with those they trusted. They learned which moments of stillness eased the chest and which habits steadied the breath. These small acts of care were not written in medical books, but they carried many lives forward. Community and routine became forms of medicine where official care remained distant. Over time, a new idea slowly formed. Anxiety was not only a flaw of the body or a weakness of character. It was also a response to pressure, loss, and uncertainty. It carried memory of danger and knowledge of risk. This idea did not erase fear, but it changed how fear could be seen. It suggested that worry might be a sign of how much a person carries, rather than a sign of how little strength they have. So the history of women's anxiety is not only a history of treatment, it is a history of how societies explained fear and how women learned to live with it. It shows how emotional pain was shaped into silence and how silence became habit. It also shows a slow movement toward listening, even if that movement was uneven and delayed. And as our long walk through this quiet history comes to rest, we are left with a gentle understanding. Anxiety did not belong only to women's bodies. It belonged to women's lives. It grew where care was heavy and protection was light. Through centuries of change, fear remained close to daily work and daily love, moving with every task and every hope. Tonight, as this story settles into stillness, we leave the past with a softer view of those who lived it. Their worry was not weakness. It was the sound of survival in a world that asked much and offered little rest. In that steady breath between fear and endurance, generations of women carried their lives forward, quietly and bravely, into the future. If this calm journey through history helped you see the past in a new way, take a peaceful moment to like this video and subscribe for more slow and thoughtful stories from long ago. Your support helps these quiet histories continue, one gentle chapter at a time.